Why does the leg move when the tendon is simply tapped? But what detects this sudden change in muscle length? But how does that information reach the spinal cord? And how does the muscle know to contract?
So, dear students, today we are going to discuss about stretch reflex. Now, what is reflex? Reflex is the involuntary muscle contraction in response to stimulus. Now, why it is called then stretch reflex? Because here the stimulus is stretching. What do you mean by the stretch? Stretch means increase in length of muscle. So, how the increase in length of the muscle become the stimulus to develop or to have involuntary muscle contraction. So let's get into lecture and let's understand the basic scaffolding of the stretch reflex. Now let's say suppose this is muscle. Now muscle has extrafusal fibers. These extrafusal fibers are main contractile part of the muscle or contractile unit of the muscle, which eventually at the end they merge with the tendon. These extrafusal fibers at the end they becomes tendon. These are extrafusal fibers contractile unit of the muscle. Now another component of the muscle is the sensory unit of the muscle, and this sensory unit of the muscle is also called muscle spindle, or it is called intrafusal fibers. Now intrafusal fibers, they have two components. One is bag fibers and another is chain fibers. So these are bag fibers and chain fibers. This muscle spindle, or you can say intrafusal fibers, these are sensory unit of the muscle, right? Now this muscle spindle has central non-contractile part, but the ends of this muscle spindle has miniature contractile component. At the end, this part can be little bit contracted. Later we will understand the importance of this miniature contractile component at the end of this muscle spindle, right? Now let's say suppose this is your section of spinal cord. It has central canal, posterior sulcus, anterior sulcus, central part of the spinal cord is occupied by gray matter. So anterior gray matter is called ventral gray horn, and posterior is called dorsal gray horn. Now we all know that the anterior gray horn or ventral gray horn is concerned with the motor system, whereas posterior gray horn is concerned with sensory system. So all the motor neurons are emerging from the anterior gray horn. All these motor neurons, they emerges from anterior gray horn. So let's say suppose one of the motor neuron is emerging from the anterior gray horn, and these motor neurons are called alpha motor neuron, and this alpha motor neuron innervate extrafusal fibers. Alpha motor neuron innervate extrafusal fibers. So when we stimulate this alpha motor neuron, they releases acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. So when we stimulate alpha motor neuron, that leads to release of acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. This acetylcholine binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptor, and eventually that is converted into the mechanical event, that is muscle contraction. So when we stimulate alpha motor neuron, that leads to contraction of the muscle. Clear? Now this sensory unit, from the sensory unit, the muscle spindle, primary and secondary nerve ending, which loop around the back fibers as well as chain fibers. So primary and secondary nerve ending, these are the type 1A and type 2 fibers. This afferent sensory fibers through dorsal root ganglia. Central process of these fibers enter through the posterior gray horn and make connection with the alpha motor neuron. Right. Why it is called sensory unit? Because the sensory afferent fibers from the back fibers as well as chain fibers through the type 1A and type 2 fibers through dorsal root ganglia enter into the spinal cord. Right. Now, the ends, we talked about ends of the muscle. If we stroke at the ends or the tendon of the muscle, what will happen? When we check the reflex like knee jerk or bicep jerk, when we check the reflex, when we stroke through the clinical hammer on the tendon, the direct impact, the stroke does not cause the contraction of the muscle. That stroking leads to the stretching or increase in length of the muscle. Now, when we stroke on the tendon, that leads to stretching of the extrafusal fibers. Stroking leads to increase in length of extrafusal fibers, and when this length of the extrafusal fiber increases, that leads to stretching of intrafusal fibers. When there is stretching of the back fibers and chain fibers of the muscle spindle, that increases action potential through this sensory efferent type 1A and type 2 fibers, which increases frequency of action potential, and this action potential reach to the spinal cord. And eventually it stimulate alpha motor neuron. So when alpha motor neuron gets stimulated, action potential run along the alpha motor neuron, and eventually it releases acetylcholine at the nerve ending, and that eventually leads to the muscle contraction through excitation contraction coupling, right? So this basic structure, the afferent fibers type 1 and type 2 fibers, the central integrating system, the efferent fibers, alpha motor neuron, and muscle itself. Muscle is called effector organ. So these are the component of reflex arc. Right. So now this is basic stretch reflex. When you stroke, that leads to stretching. Stretching leads to increased action frequency of action potential through the sensory efferent fibers that stimulate alpha motor neuron, and eventually muscle will contract. Now another motor neuron that is emerging from the anterior gray horn, which supplies ends of this muscle spindle, intrafusal fibers. See, alpha motor neurons innervate extrafusal fibers, but This gamma motor neuron innervate intrafusal fibers, but at the end where the miniature contractile component are there, right? Now type 1A fibers mostly responsible for the dynamic, it has a dynamic as well as static component. What do you mean by dynamic and static component? Static component when person is stand still, when person is not moving in static posture, and dynamic when person is walking. So this type 1A and they have dynamic as well as static component, whereas type 2 has only static component. So this type 1 and type 2 fiber increase frequency of discharge, increase frequency of action potential when person is standing, but during walking or running, maintenance of posture occurred during by which type of fiber? Type 1A fibers. Okay. Now gamma motor neuron, what is the significance of this gamma motor neuron? So gamma motor neuron gets activated or gets stimulated along with the alpha motor neuron. When person is voluntarily contract muscle, that leads to decrease in length of the muscle. When muscle length is reducing, when during voluntary contraction, length of the muscle reduces. When length of the muscle reduces, that leads to decrease in firing of this muscle spindle. So action potential frequency reduces through these efferent fibers. When this action potential or the traffic of action potential reduces through the efferent fibers, this is called unloading of muscle spindle. So frequency of discharge will be reduces, and that leads to reduction in the maintenance of the length, or that reduces sensitivity of stretch reflex. But this is prevented, this unloading is prevented by gamma motor neuron. How? So along with the alpha motor neuron, this gamma motor neuron also gets stimulated, and when this gamma motor neuron gets stimulated, this gamma motor neuron innervate innervate ends of the muscle spindle intrafusal fibers, and they have miniature contractile component. So when this miniature contractile component gets contracted, that leads to the stretching of, when ends are contracted, that leads to, when ends are contracted, that leads to stretching of the central part of the muscle spindle, central part of the muscle spindle, and which eventually increase the frequency of action potential. So even at the static posture, or uh, this low frequency, this gamma motor neuron has low frequency asynchronous discharge. So gamma motor neuron basically help in preventing unloading of the muscle spindle, as well as it maintain sensitivity of stretch reflex along with the alpha motor neuron. That principle is called alpha gamma coactivation. Alpha gamma coactivation. So this alpha gamma coactivation prevent unloading, increase or maintaining the sensitivity of the stretch reflex, and maintain the posture during the static posture. right? Now, this low frequency asynchronous discharge is due to gamma motor neuron. Now, this low frequency asynchronous discharge, which is running along this gamma loop, helps in keeping the muscle in partially contracted state. When low frequency asynchronous discharge is moving through this gamma loop, that leads to eventually partial stimulation of alpha motor neuron, and that keeps muscle in partially contracted state, and that is called tone of the muscle. Partial contraction of the muscle is called tone of the muscle. So what is the importance of this gamma motor neuron? First is alpha gamma coactivation, and that leads to that prevents unloading of the muscle spindle, maintain the posture, and maintenance of the tone, right? So this is the basic understanding of the stretch reflex, right? Now another concept I need to elaborate is the inverse stretch reflex. Concept of inverse stretch reflex. Now deep within tendon there is Golgi tendon organ. Deep within tendon there is Golgi tendon organ. Now, what is role of this Golgi tendon organ, or it is also called Golgi tendon reflex? But when it fires. Now, Golgi tendon organ through type 1B fiber. These efferent fibers are type 1B fibers. And this is Viva question for the PG student, type 1B fibers. They, through the dorsal root ganglia, enter into spinal cord and make synapse with interneurons. And these black interneurons, they synapse with alpha motor neurons. So this type 1B fibers, when get stimulated, they stimulate these interneurons, but these interneurons inhibit alpha motor neuron. Type 1B fiber stimulate, see in stretch reflex, type 1A fiber and type 2 fibers, this directly stimulate alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron. But this type 1B fibers, they stimulate interneurons, that interneurons, small neurons, that they inhibit alpha motor neuron. Now, the question is why, how this type 1B fibers increase, they get stimulated. So when muscle is too much contracted, when muscle is too much contracted, and when muscle is about to detach from its attachment, and muscle become, there will be too much tension in the muscle. When muscle is contracted, there will be too much tension in the muscle, and the moment comes when the muscle is about to evolve from the attachment. At that time, this Golgi tendon organ fires, and increased discharge occur in these type 1B fibers, and which eventually stimulate interneurons, and that interneurons inhibit alpha motor neuron and muscle get relaxed. So basically this Golgi tendon reflex is inverse stretch reflex. This type 1A fibers and type 2 fibers from the muscle spindle stimulate alpha motor neuron, but it is monosynaptic. There are no interneurons. So stretch reflex is itself monosynaptic, whereas Golgi tendon reflex is disynaptic. Okay, clear? So this Golgi tendon organ respond to change in rate of tension within the muscle, whereas stretch reflex respond to change in length of the muscle. This is the basic conclusion of the stretch reflex and inverse stretch reflex. So this is all about stretch reflex. We'll learn about the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron in next lecture. Thank you.
That's all for today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep understanding physiology. See you in the next lecture.